chapter 4.4, part 4. So this particular chapter is a little more meaty. There's a lot more to get into, so I know it's a little bit longer. So our last piece we're going to look at or second to last, Perception, Senses, and Psychology, is Yayoi Kusama. Amazing artist. She is an elderly woman now living in a mental institution in Japan. And then she goes out during the day to her studio, and then she goes back at night and stays at the mental institution. She's been doing this for, I would say, more than 40 years. But originally, she was this amazing artist. There's a great film on her if you ever want to watch it. But she originally came into New York from Japan in the 60s and met Warhol and met all these people, and she kind of flipped out and realized that she, couldn't really cope with the New York art world. Some of her ideas were ripped off even by Warhol, and then she kind of went back into the mental institution, but she's found a way now to make her work and spread it all over the world. Absolutely huge artist. Um, these pieces are everywhere. LACMA will have them. And what they are these dots that she would see. It's kind of like she would see them, literally see dots, or she would see nets. And then the dots are sort of the holes between the nets all over everything. It's somewhat sort of like planets and stars, and that they're covering all of us. But we are also the planets themselves, if that makes sense. When she shows up to one of her openings, she dresses with an outfit like, perhaps for this one she might wear a white dress with red spots, but she'll wear something corresponding to the to the opening and to the work that she's making at that time. So this one's 2009, but the last 10, 15 years, it's been ramping up continually, I think since the late 90s. But now she is one of the top 10, in the top three, I think, even of artists in the world. These are all over. People love them. They're interactive. So her time came at a later point in time. Originally, when she was a young woman, she became very frustrated as an artist and was not able to make work and show it, at least, for quite a long time. And then she kind of edged her way back and was rediscovered. So it's kind of an amazing story. But what her work is are installation works. You go into them. They're not super interactive all the time. It just depends on the piece. Some of them, Infinity Room was one that was like lights and mirrors, so it looked like it went on forever. She does use mirrors, if you can see, like it does make the space look larger. The space actually ends here and here. This kind of obliterates the edge right there, but you can see where this is the actual room, but since there are mirrors, it looks like it keeps going. She doesn't always use the dots, like the Infinity Room or little lights. You might have seen images of that. People love to do selfies in these spaces, so it was just kind of one of those sort of funny matches that came later in her life, where it matched with selfie taking culture and interactive artwork and installations, and just her playful sense of the dots, and her wishing to sort of have an interaction, yet not, sort of be around people in a bigger way, if that makes sense. But very lighthearted, sweet pieces, but they're actually reflections of her hallucinations of dots and nets. She compares them to the cosmos, like I said. Each of us are the dots, and she covers herself as well with the dots, and she did that way back in the 60s to sort of make herself disappear, but originally that came from kind of a breakdown where she thought she was disappearing. Van Gogh, which is one of our favorite, if not the favorite, mentally unstable artist in the world. But, it's an interesting thing, and I've had different professors sort of tell me this, where it's a kind of a close line, if you want to say, between sort of that OCD, that obsessiveness in order to finish work, or that exploration of newness or strangeness or colors, or getting into these creative areas in the brain. And it's very close to some of these things that we might call insanity. So some of our most creative, like I just showed you, Yayoi Kusama, who's one of the most famous artists in the world right now. And then we're looking now at Van Gogh. Some of these people, because they explored these far reaches, or these, you might want to say they're pioneers or they're explorers on the edges of the ability of the brain, suffered greatly for that. Now, it's a chicken and the egg. No one knows really if the work pushed them in that direction or the work is really more therapeutic. It's hard to say. Van Gogh is very challenged mentally, severe mental illness. And I don't want to go too far into this piece, but the main point of the piece is that the colors have significant personal meanings to him, because we're dealing with perception here and senses. But he would have those bright yellows and different colors that he used had personal meaning to him. So you see these strange colors in the background, or different colors that he would use that wouldn't be what we call local color. What local color means is if that person really has green eyes, they're painted green, or the flesh tone is actually flesh tone, the pipe is brown. But sometimes later in modern art, we see the pipe is some crazy kind of blue, and the eyes are black, or something like that, or the skin would be mottled bright green, or something like that, so that it is an invented color. But he uses local color, but he also uses other colors and heightens them for his own personal expression. Okay, so the last segment we're going to get into is science as a tool to understand and care for art. And more, there's all these kind of interesting things, and even past the point of where this book has been printed, things happen all the time. They're coming up with all these different discoveries and ways to sort of look into an artwork that maybe a lot of times what it comes into play is there are a lot of fakes out there, and there are a lot of people who paint paintings like a famous master. They try to imitate that and sell for a lot of money. So they have all these scientific advancements now to authenticate artwork. But also, they x-ray work, and they can get little tiny paint samples. They need less and less smidgens of paint so that they don't have to invade the work as much as they used to do, because, if you have a very valuable artwork, you don't want it damaged by somebody boring a big hole into it. So now they're able to really look into some of these chemical properties and using x-rays. So the first thing we're going to look at, and it's kind of ironic because she's Madame X, we're going to look at an x-ray of Madame X, John Singer Sargent. Contemporaneous, if we remember Thomas Eakins, he's another painter painting in this style, beautiful flesh tones, detailed, American artist. And he would paint figures and sort of singular in this way. There's different types of Sargent paintings, but they're just absolutely stunning. So when this showed, it debuted in the Salon, and we'll talk about the Salon a little bit more. We get into Turner in chapter 2.2. But the Salon exhibitions, there was a Salon in London and one in Paris, and this was from Paris, I believe. It was criticized for eroticism, and for us, we were a little bit like, why is there a criticism for this? So when the X-ray came out, because to our mind, this is very sedate, it's not that erotic. So the X-ray came out, and apparently this strap, the shoulder strap, was originally off her shoulder. So that's where that sense of more suggestive or eroticized woman would have been. So if we're looking at this painting and her shoulder strap is here, then we think of her a little bit differently, perhaps, than we might with this formal ball gown. She, and then he changed her name, and actually we found out who she was later. But during the show in the Salon, he changed the title to Madame X because there was so much criticism about her eroticized nature and her unseemliness. He didn't want to embarrass her, so he pulled her name out. So what we think now, what happened is, while it was showing in the Salon, he repainted it and put the shoulder strap upright, so she did not look as, how would want to say, like a floozy, I suppose, would be the easiest way to describe it. Okay, another restoration which was extremely controversial, and I think people are still sort of chattering about this today, was the Sistine Chapel. Now, there have been different restorations over the years because Michelangelo was on his back doing this thing in the Renaissance, and then back in the day before electricity, we had candles in there and probably even fires in certain areas to keep it warm. Um, but the smoke and bacteria and heat and light and humidity had caused a lot of damage to the painting up here on the ceiling. Now, when the millennium came through, it was restored in 1980 to 1989, but it was all done for the year 2000 so that Rome and the Vatican would be prepared. The Catholic Church spent a lot of money cleaning up and restoring a lot of work so that people would see things anew in the year 2000. At any rate, there was a lot of discussion about how much color or how much paint was taken off the coating that what they thought that maybe was a varnish. Because if you think about Da Vinci used a lot of varnishes and Michelangelo did not, but that was not known, if that makes sense. So in the Renaissance, what would happen would be they'd use a lot of underpainting, which would be colors underneath the flesh tone. Maybe they would paint like a brown and then paint these other lighter colors over it and so on. But after, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry. So what they thought was when the restoration was done in 1989, it was finished, the colors were very, very bright. So other restorers and other people thought you took too much off. You took the varnish, the darkening agent, this medium that was used to tone it down. You took that off, and now it looks garish and too bright. Well, come to find out through some other explorations much more recently, 2005 and so on, they discovered that he did not use varnishes and that it was correct and that those were the colors. We've gotten used to looking at a 500-year-old painting and thinking that it's dark and thick and kind of smoky looking because we're used to looking at these paintings with damage from the environment and smoke. So this was kind of a revelation to have another way to really look at the chemical compositions, to radiograph it and so on, to scan it, and to find out that there were not these varnishes as suspected. It really was a very bright, shockingly bright, um, and it was a not a fresco secco. It was a buon fresco, which means wet. And it's a wet fresco. It was done and it's soaked into the plaster. Dry fresco is kind of touching up on top of the surface on the dry plaster, but the plaster's wet. You apply the pigment directly onto it, and it binds it into the plaster, if that makes sense. Fresco is very laborious, but you have a very short working time. You have to work quickly before it dries. So they accuse the restorers of removing all the varnish and so on. More details, of course, in our book.